Marcus Whitfield spent 11 years building a company with his best friend, and it took less than 11 minutes for that friend to take it all away. He signed away everything he had worked for on a Tuesday afternoon in a lawyer's office that smelled like old coffee, believing he was saving the business he loved. He was wrong. What he didn't know was that the man across the table, the man he trusted more than his own brother, had already planned every part of that meeting months in advance. 20 years later, that same man would stand in a courtroom and watch everything he built on that lie fall apart in front of him. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is the story of Marcus Whitfield and Terrence Kessler, two men who built something real together and then watched trust turn into betrayal. What Terrence did to his own partner would take almost 2 decades to come fully into the light. Along the way, there are 3 questions worth holding on to. What exactly happened in that lawyer's office? Why did nobody catch it for 20 years? And what finally brought the truth back to the surface after Terrence had convinced himself he was safe? Stay with this one until the end, because the ending is not what most people expect from a story like this. Marcus and Terrence met in 1985 working the same shift at a machine shop outside Dayton, Ohio. They were both in their 20s, both broke, both convinced they could build something better than working for someone else. 3 years later, with a loan from Marcus's father-in-law and a second-hand lathe they bought at auction, they opened a small parts fabrication business out of a rented warehouse. They called it Kessler and Whitfield Manufacturing, and they split everything 50-50 on a handshake first and later on paper. Terrence had the charm and the sales instinct. Marcus had the discipline and the technical eye. Together, they were good. For the first 10 years, the company grew slowly but steadily, landing small contracts with local factories and eventually a few larger clients in the automotive supply chain. By the mid-1990s, Kessler and Whitfield had grown into a business worth several $1 million, with 40 employees and a reputation for quality that took a decade to build. Marcus ran the floor. He knew every machine, every supplier, every employee's kid's name. Terrence ran the relationships, the contracts, the money. It worked because each man trusted the other completely with the half of the business he didn't understand. Marcus never once asked to see the full financial picture because why would he? Terrence was his friend before he was his partner. They had been in each other's weddings. Terrence was godfather to Marcus's oldest son. There was no reason, in Marcus's mind, to ever look closely at what Terrence was doing with the books. That trust is exactly what made what came next possible. In 1997, a recession hit the automotive supply industry hard, and Kessler and Whitfield's biggest client cut orders by nearly half. Cash flow tightened. Terrence came to Marcus with a plan. He said the only way to survive the downturn was to restructure the company's ownership to satisfy a nervous bank that was threatening to call in their loan. He explained it slowly, patiently, the way you'd explain something to a friend you were trying to protect from panic. He told Marcus that if they didn't act fast, they could lose everything, the building, the equipment, all of it. He said the bank wanted to see one clear owner on paper, someone the loan officers could hold accountable, and that once the crisis passed, Marcus's ownership would be restored in full. Marcus had no reason to doubt him. He signed the paperwork Terrence's lawyer had prepared, transferring his shares into Terrence's name as a temporary measure, believing his friend's promise that this was simply what the moment required. What Marcus didn't know was that there was no bank pressure at all. The loan was never in danger of being called. Terrence had manufactured the entire crisis, using a forged letter on bank letterhead and a valuation of the company that undercut its real worth by more than half. Within 6 months of that signature, Terrence quietly restructured the ownership permanently, using a clause buried in the paperwork that converted Marcus's temporary transfer into a full and final buyout at a price that barely covered what Marcus had originally put in 11 years earlier. Marcus found out he had lost his company the same way most people find out they've lost something valuable, in a short conversation that didn't feel real until much later. Terrence told him gently, almost sympathetically, that the ownership structure had become permanent as part of the loan agreement, and that there was nothing either of them could do to reverse it now. Marcus walked out of that meeting believing it was bad luck, a casualty of a tough economy, nothing more. He shook Terrence's hand on his way out the door. For the next 20 years, Terrence Kessler's business thrived, freed from having to split profits and holding full control over every decision. He expanded aggressively, landing contracts that Marcus had spent years pursuing without success. By 2010, Kessler Manufacturing had grown into one of the largest independent part suppliers in the state, with Terrence's name on the building on local business awards, and eventually on a wing of a hospital he donated money to build. He became the kind of man people pointed to as proof that hard work paid off. He gave interviews about resilience during the recession. He never once mentioned Marcus's name in any of them. Marcus, meanwhile, started over with almost nothing. He took a job managing a smaller shop 2 towns over, using the technical skill Terrence never had, but without the capital or the contract to ever build something of his own again. For years, he told himself the same story Terrence had given him, that it was simply bad timing, bad luck, the kind of thing that happens in business. He didn't examine it too closely, partly because it hurt too much, and partly because he still, even after everything, didn't want to believe his old friend had done this to him on purpose. That belief held for almost 2 decades, until a phone call in 2016 changed everything. The call came from a former bookkeeper at Kessler Manufacturing, a woman named Patricia Coleman, who had worked there in the final years before retiring. She had come across old financial records while helping Terrence's accountant prepare for an unrelated audit, records that had never been fully destroyed the way Terrence assumed they had been. Among them was the original 1997 valuation report and a copy of the bank letter Terrence had used to justify the restructuring. Patricia noticed something that didn't sit right with her. The bank listed on the letterhead had never actually issued a loan to Kessler and Whitfield during that period, a fact she could confirm because she had personally handled the company's loan paperwork for over a decade. She reached out to Marcus, someone she barely knew, because she couldn't shake the feeling that what she'd found mattered to someone. Marcus took the documents to a lawyer, expecting to be told there was nothing left to do after so many years. Instead, the lawyer found something that changed the entire case. Ohio law allows fraud claims to be reopened when new evidence proves the fraud was actively concealed, and the statute of limitations resets from the date of discovery rather than the date of the original act. Patricia's documents didn't just suggest wrongdoing, they proved it. The bank Terrence claimed had pressured him into the restructuring had no record of any loan to the company at all during that period. The valuation Terrence used to justify the buyout had been prepared by an appraiser who, records later showed, had been paid directly by Terrence in cash, off the books, 3 weeks before the letter was drafted. What followed was an 18-month legal battle that Terrence never expected to face. He had spent 20 years building not just a company, but an identity, a public reputation as a self-made success story, and none of it had anywhere near the same foundation once the original fraud came to light. During depositions, the appraiser Terrence had paid confirmed under oath that he had been instructed to lowball the company's value, and that Terrence had told him at the time it was, in the appraiser's words, only a formality that wouldn't matter in the long run. That single line, recorded on the record, became the moment the case turned. Terrence's lawyers pushed for a settlement rather than risk a jury hearing the full extent of what had been done to a man who had once called Terrence his best friend. In 2018, 21 years after that signature in the lawyer's office, Marcus Whitfield reached a settlement that recognized what had actually happened to him in 1997. It didn't come as a criminal conviction, because too much time and too many buried records made that path nearly impossible to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But it came as a civil judgment large enough to force Terrence to sell off a portion of the company he had spent 2 decades building on a foundation Marcus never agreed to give up. Terrence kept his freedom. He did not keep his empire or his reputation or the quiet certainty he had lived with for 20 years that what he'd done would never come back to find him. Marcus didn't celebrate when it was over. Those who knew him during that period say he didn't smile much even after the settlement was announced, and he never once did an interview about it, despite requests from local papers curious about the story behind the case. He used part of the money to help his oldest son start a small business of his own, one built, he said, on paper that meant what it said. He never spoke to Terrence again after the case closed. The two men who had once stood beside each other at each other's weddings never exchanged another word. What stays with people who follow stories like this isn't usually the money or the lawsuit. It's the quiet 20 years in between, the years Terrence spent believing he had gotten away with something, and the years Marcus spent believing it had simply been bad luck. Somewhere in that gap between what each man believed was true, the actual truth sat waiting, patient in a filing cabinet, for someone to find it. It makes you wonder how many other quiet arrangements, made in good faith by one person and bad faith by another, are still sitting in a drawer somewhere, waiting for their own Patricia Coleman to notice something that doesn't add up. Would you have caught what Marcus missed? Would you have trusted your best friend the same way? Let us know what you would have done in the comments below. And if this story stayed with you, there's another one waiting about a different kind of trust, broken in a different kind of way. Subscribe so you don't miss it.